66 million years ago, in the floodplains of what is now South Dakota, something walked the earth that looked like it had crawled straight out of a medieval legend. A skull built like armor, spikes curling backward from the snout, horns crowning the back of its head like a war helmet. When paleontologists finally uncovered it in 2003, they didn't know what to call it, until a group of school children gave it a name pulled straight from fantasy fiction: Dracorex hogwartsia, the Dragon King of Hogwarts. But the real story is stranger than the name suggests. This dragon would go on to spark one of the most contentious identity crises in dinosaur science. A debate about whether it was ever a distinct species at all, or just a dinosaur going through an awkward phase. This is the story of the flat-headed dragon, the bone-domed. In 2003, 3 amateur fossil hunters from Sioux City, Iowa, were prospecting the Hell Creek Formation, a stretch of badlands famous for producing Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, and some of the last dinosaurs to walk the Earth before the Chicxulub asteroid ended the Cretaceous period. What they found was a nearly complete skull, roughly 42 centimeters long, unlike anything catalogued before. It had no dome. That alone was strange, because the animal clearly belonged to a group of dinosaurs famous for having. The specimen was donated to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis in 2004, and in 2006, paleontologists Robert Baker and Robert Sullivan formally described it in the journal Dracorex hogwartsia, NGen N-Speak, a spiked, flat-headed pachycephalosaurid dinosaur from the Upper Cretaceous Hell Creek Formation of South Dakota. The holotype specimen, the single physical fossil that officially defines the species, was catalogued as TCMI 2004.17.1, and it remains the only known skull of its kind, alongside a partial second skull discovered later. The name itself came from the public. Visitors to the museum, many of them children captivated by the Harry Potter book series, suggested the species name Hogwartsia, a tribute to the fictional wizarding school. Draco, meaning dragon, sealed the theme. But strip away the storybook name, and what remained was a genuine...
To understand why Dracorex caused such a stir, you need to understand the family it was placed in. The Pachycephalosauridae, the thick-headed lizards. These were bipedal, plant-eating dinosaurs that lived across North America and Asia during the late Cretaceous, roughly 85 to 66 million years ago. Most species are known almost exclusively from skulls, because their small, lightly built skeletons rarely preserved as well as their dense, rock-hard cranial domes. Their signature feature was a thickened skull roof, in some species built up into a rounded dome that could measure several inches of solid bone. For decades, the leading theory was that Pachycephalosaurus used these domes the way bighorn sheep use their horns, for headbutting contests, either to establish dominance or compete for mates. More recent studies have questioned whether their necks and domes could actually withstand a direct head-on collision, suggesting flank butting or head shoving may have been just as likely. But the domes, whatever their true function, define the group. Pachycephalosaurus typically walked on 2 legs, had short forelimbs, long stiffened tails for balance, and small leaf-shaped teeth suited to a diet of low-lying plants, seeds, and possibly some insects. Dracorex, however, broke the pattern immediately. It had all the ornamentation, the spikes, the nose, the horns, but it had no dome whatsoever. Its skull roof was flat. That single detail would end up connecting it to 2 other dinosaurs in a way nobody expected. 20 years before Dracorex was found, paleontologists Peter Galton and Hans-Dieter Suess described another unusual pachycephalosaur from the same Hell Creek formation. They named it Stygimoloch spinifer in 1983, Horned Devil of the River Styx. The name Fint. Its skull bore a crown of long, backward-curving horns projecting from the squamosal bones at the rear of the head, along with a smaller, narrower dome than its more famous relative, Pachycephalosaurus. The holotype of Stygimoloch is a single left squamosal, the horned bone at the back of the skull, catalogued as UCMP 119433, housed at the University of California Museum of Paleontology. For years, Stygimoloch was known almost entirely from these scrappy, disarticulated pieces, fragments of horn-bearing skull roof, rather than a complete cranium. More complete material eventually surfaced, described in detail by Goodwin and colleagues in 1998, including a more intact skull catalogued as MPM 8111. It showed the same pattern, a modest dome ringed by an elaborate array of horns and nodes, far more ornate than the smooth, massive dome of adult Pachycephalosaurus. For over 2 decades, Stygimoloch stood as its own genus and species, a spiky, horn-crowned cousin sharing the same ecosystem at the same time as its dome-headed relatives. That coexistence was about to become a problem. Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis is the namesake of the entire family, and by far the largest known member. Its earliest remains, a thick, solid dome fragment, were described in 1931 by Charles Gilmore, who initially classified the bone under a different genus entirely, mistaking it for part of a different kind of reptile. It wasn't until 1943 that Barnum Brown and Eric Marin Schleicher formally erected the genus Pachycephalosaurus, based on a much more complete skull recovered from the Hell Creek Formation near Ekalaka, Montana. That specimen, a nearly complete skull catalogued as AMNH 1696, housed at the American Museum of Natural History, remains the best-known adult example of the species to this day. Unlike the spiky ornamentation of Stygimoloch or Dracorex, adult Pachycephalosaurus skulls are dominated by a single, smooth, hemispherical dome that can be over 20 centimeters thick at its peak, one of the densest skull structures known among dinosaurs. The horns and nodes that decorate the rear of the skull in other pachycephalosaurs are reduced here to blunt, worn-down knobs, as if eroded away by growth. 3 dinosaurs, then: Dracorex, Stygimoloch, and Pachycephalosaurus, all from the same rock formation, the same time period, the same general region of North America. A flat head with long horns, a small dome with long horns, a big dome with stubby knobs. To some scientists, that progression looked less like 3 separate species and more like 3 stages of one animal growing up. In 2007, paleontologist Jack Horner of the Museum of the Rockies presented a controversial idea at the annual meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. He proposed that Dracorex hogwartsia and Stygimoloch spinifer were not separate species at all. They were juvenile and sub-adult growth stages of Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis. In 2009, Horner and paleontologist Mark Goodwin of the University of California, Berkeley, formally published the hypothesis in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS ONE in a paper titled Extreme Cranial Ontogeny in the Upper Cretaceous Dinosaur Pachycephalosaurus. Their argument rested on histology, the microscopic study of bone tissue, combined with CT scanning of skull material across a growth series, from the smallest known juvenile specimens to the largest adult domes. What they found was that the dome of Pachycephalosaurus doesn't appear fully formed. It develops gradually, expanding outward and absorbing surrounding bone as the animal matures. The horns and spikes that dominate the skulls of Dracorex and Stygimoloch, they argued, are exactly what you'd expect to see on a juvenile or subadult individual, before the dome had finished growing and before those ornamental horns were resorbed into the thickening skull roof. In this model, the sequence goes like this. A young Pachycephalosaurus starts out with a flat, spike-covered skull, matching the Dracorex morphology. As it grows, the frontoparietal bones begin to swell into a small dome, while the horns remain prominent, matching the Stygimoloch morphology. Finally, in a fully mature adult, the dome expands to its maximum size, incorporating and smoothing over the surrounding horns into blunt nodes, the classic Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis appearance. Supporting this, additional support arrived nearly a decade later. In 2016, Goodwin and colleagues described newly discovered juvenile Pachycephalosaur skull material that filled in even earlier points in the proposed growth sequence, reinforcing the idea that these dramatic cranial transformations were a real developmental pathway, not a coincidence of preservation. If the hypothesis is correct, Dracorex hogwartsia isn't a separate species. It's simply what a young Pachycephalosaurus looked like before it grew up, making Dracorex what paleontologists sometimes informally call an ontogomorph, a growth stage mistaken for a distinct taxon. Not every paleontologist accepts the growth stage hypothesis. Robert Sullivan, one of the original describers of Dracorex, has argued that the stratigraphic and morphological evidence doesn't cleanly support collapsing all three names into one species. Critics of the ontogeny hypothesis point out a few sticking points. First, stratigraphy. Some analyses suggest Stygimoloch specimens tend to come from slightly older rock layers than the most complete adult Pachycephalosaurus material, which would be an odd pattern if they were simply younger individuals of the same population living at the same time. Second, sample size. The entire hypothesis rests on comparing a relatively small number of skulls across a fragmentary fossil record, where individual variation, sexual dimorphism, or even distinct closely related species could produce similar-looking patterns. Other researchers, including Nicholas Longridge and colleagues, have published rebuttals questioning whether the specific horn resorption pattern described by Horner and Goodwin is as clear-cut as proposed, or whether it could instead reflect pathology, damage, or genuine taxonomic differences between individuals. The debate remains unresolved in the scientific literature. Some databases and institutions now list Stygimoloch and Dracorex as junior synonyms of Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis. Others continue to treat all three as provisionally valid, pending further discoveries. Ideally, an actual growth series of skulls from a single, well-documented bone bed that could settle the question definitively. What's not in dispute is this: whether they represent one species or three. Regardless of how the naming dispute is eventually resolved, we have a fairly confident picture of what these animals looked like in life. Pachycephalosaurus, in its adult form, was one of the larger members of its family, estimated at up to 4.5 meters long, walking on sturdy hind legs with short arms held close to the body. Its skin was almost certainly scaled, likely patterned for camouflage in the forested floodplains and river systems of late Cretaceous North America, an ecosystem it shared with Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus rex. Whether it used its skull to headbutt rivals, ram flanks, or simply display for potential mates remains an open question. But the sheer investment in cranial architecture, whether flat and spiked or domed and thick, suggests these structures played some role in social behavior, likely tied to competition or courtship within the species. And if the growth hypothesis holds true, then the juveniles, the Dracorex stage individuals, would have looked strikingly different from their parents. Flatter skulled, more heavily spiked, almost dragon-like, before their skulls gradually reshaped into the smooth, weaponized dome of adulthood. A single species wearing 2 or even 3 dramatically different faces across its lifetime. In the end, the animal that children named after a fictional wizarding school may turn out to be one of the best real-world examples of how dramatically a dinosaur could change as it grew. A reminder that a single fossil skull is only ever a snapshot, one frame in a much longer story of growth, change, and time. Whether Dracorex hogwartsia, Stygimoloch spinifer, and Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis are ultimately confirmed as one species or 3, the debate itself represents something valuable. Science working exactly as it should, proposing a hypothesis, testing it against the bones, and staying open to revision as new evidence comes to light. The Dragon King of Hogwarts may not have been a distinct species after all, but real dinosaurs, it turns out, didn't need mythology to be strange enough on their own.